Hello and welcome back to my channel, The MMA Girl. I am, of course, Jess, The MMA Girl, and welcome to my new setup. I haven't really changed much about my background, just about how I've set my desk up and everything. So I hope you like the little changes I'm making. We'll get there one day. I'll stick to something consistently once I've found what works best for me. But I think I like this setup, so we'll see if this continues. In any case, I've hopped on here today because last night we had UFC Noche and Canelo versus Crawford, and there is a lot to unpack, so I had to get on here. We're going to be talking UFC Noche and all things Diego Lopez versus Jean Silva because it was lit. UFC Noche was amazing. And as you guys may have seen in my last video, I predicted all but one main card fight correctly, so I'm very happy with how that worked out for myself. And I'm happy that my predictions were correct because I often do get excited and predict that there will be a KO everywhere or submissions everywhere. I only predicted one decision. Other than that, I really did want there to be as much action and as much excitement as possible, as UFC Noche does represent the Mexican Independence Day, something that is very important to the UFC, very important to the UFC fans, and it's a really, really good celebration. And we had headlining this card Diego Lopez, who, whilst he was born in Brazil, this man works, trains, and lives in Mexico, and he is, of course, a Spanish speaker now, fully fluent Spanish and Portuguese, and he speaks mainly Spanish from what I understand when he talks in his language. So he represents Brazil and Mexico in one go, and that's amazing. And we, of course, had opposite him a fighting nerd who was holding the last undefeated record at the UFC for the fighting nerds. Of course, we saw last weekend, unfortunately, Mr. Caio Bravo in the main event against Nassourdine Imavov lose his 0 at the UFC. He didn't have, of course, a clean record professionally, but in the UFC he'd never lost, and he hadn't lost in 10 years. So Imavov gave him his first loss in 10 years and his first loss at the UFC. And of course, previously we had Carlos Prates lose his UFC undefeated record to the one and only Ian Gary, who he was sat next to whilst watching UFC Paris and was crying over Rufi's incredibly shocking performance and display of lack of grappling. But that is not what we're talking about today. We are talking about UFC Noche. I'm going to go over all the exciting moments from this card, and of course we're going to go over specifically Diego Lopez, Jean Silva, and what this means for the featherweight division now, and what this may mean for the fighting nerds and Jean Silva in general in the featherweight division. Has he been forechecked, or is this just a slip up on the road, and will we see more from Jean Silva, and will he still be able to move up the ranks of the featherweight division? Let's get analysing. We had, of course, the very exciting debut fight on the prelims card, which was, of course, the Ultimate Fighter's very own final between Rodrigo Cezinando and Daniil Donchenko. Of course, Daniil Donchenko got the KO victory in the first round. It was a bloody mess and a bloody victory for Daniil. Alden Correa KO'd Alessandro Costa in the third round, just under 50 seconds. And what a beautiful KO it was. Of course, we had, unfortunately, the Cedric Dumas versus Zachary Reese fight happen and end very abruptly via no contest due to accidental illegal move. And of course, the low blow caused Cedric Dumas to leave limping and stretched out of the octagon. And of course, Zachary Reese was left in the octagon to get his hand raised for the no contest. And it was a shame to see that. Of course, both guys looked very excited to fight, very excited to be back in the octagon at the UFC, and every opportunity you're in the octagon at the UFC, it must be seized. So unfortunately for both guys, they won't likely get a fight anytime soon unless the UFC want to run it back. And sometimes the UFC don't want to run things back like that because it's not the most exciting of fights to run back if this kind of situation happens again. But it was, of course, that accidental from Zachary Reese, and I do hope he doesn't feel too bad because it could have happened to anyone. But it was just hard to see happen in the first round of this prelim fight that people were quite excited to see. And the last fight on the prelim fight card, ESPN featured prelim, was the fight most people were complaining about because they were saying this fight was going to be the most boring fight on the whole of the card. But it turned out to be quite an exciting bout. Blood was shed, and of course Jose Medina unfortunately lost via submission to Dusko Todorovic in the very first round. So big fight, great ESPN featured prelim. Next up for the main card, we had, of course, debuting in the UFC, a new bright spark for the bantamweight division, Santiago Luna, and he was taking on Lukong. And of course, most people chose Lukong as the winner of this fight, of course, previously. And I chose Luna because he was undefeated. He looked like a better striker. He has an array of victories via KO and submission. And there you have it. He did it in one single round, and he showed the UFC why he is a new contender for the bantamweights in this company. And of course, he got the only bonus outside of the Diego Lopez versus Jean Silva fight, because there were only 2 bonuses given out for performance of the night. One, of course, was to Diego Lopez, and the other was to Santiago Luna. So very cool to see a debuting fighter already getting those bonus points, and hopefully we'll see him very soon. Next up, we had another rising star, Alexander Hernandez, who of course got the RKO. Wrong business. What the hell? Got the KO victory over Diego Ferreira. Diego Ferreira looked very dangerous yesterday night. He has shaved all his hair off, buzz cut. He looks more dangerous, more serious, but looks can be deceiving. And of course, a lot of guys come back from bad starts to fights, as did Gaston, which we'll get onto later on. And again, we see Alexander Hernandez get that win in his hometown of San Antonio, Texas. He, of course, wants Michael Chandler now. And I think that would be an amazing fight. And I'd love to see Hernandez take on Michael Chandler. And I feel like they have a very similar stance and a very similar fighting style. So I'd love to see how those two do in the octagon one-on-one. We next had, of course, Gastelum. I didn't get a chance to talk about that in my last video because I recorded my predictions video before the weigh-ins happened, of course. That is sometimes a mistake because sometimes the weigh-ins cause cancellations. And when I saw Gastelum yet again not making weight, I said to myself, what are the chances that he has to pull out this fight or the fight is cancelled? But Stolfus agreed to fight Gastelum despite him being 5 pounds overweight, 2.5 kilos overweight. And of course, he forfeited 25% of his purse to Stolfus. So he, of course, got the win by UD, but of course, a part of his purse was now in Stolfus's pocket. It was a great competitive fight. Lots of striking in there. And Stolfus, of course, had a very great first round, which is quite surprising to me, seeing the outcome of this fight. And there were quite a few moments where he could have got the giddy, and he didn't. He jumped the giddy, but he didn't get it. Gaston, of course, a very skilled grappler, as well as a very skilled striker. As I said in my predictions video, I just think he's the more skilled opponent. So that's why he won that fight. So very excited to see Gaston back in the win column, of course. And hopefully either he moves up to light heavyweight, which I think would be ridiculous, seeing his size. He's so small compared to Stolfus, which is why I think Stolfus said to himself, I'll go for it anyway because he's so much smaller than me. But he's a small, compact human being. And I think moving up to light heavyweight would just be too much for him because you've seen how big Alex Pereira is compared to Gaston. It just is 2 worlds apart. But he needs to finish this whole weight issue problem before the fight. So hopefully the next time we see Gaston in the octagon, he will be on weight for the middleweight division and not having to move up again because the UFC can't deal with his missing weight every time, which would be such a shame for him anyways. In any case, congratulations to Gaston. And again, I said he was going to win by UD. I'm just saying. This is the fight I got wrong, however, Rafa Garcia versus Jared Gordon. Jared Gordon was my pick for UFC's Noche card, and he lost via TKO in the third. I thought he would hold on, honestly, Jared Gordon. We then heard, of course, from Bilal Muhammad that early on that week, he had gotten into a car crash and it had busted up his knee. And he did not want to pull out this fight for love nor money, so he decided to stay on and do this fight. Safe to say, if he hadn't have had that car crash and got that knee injury, maybe he would have been in a better situation in this fight against Garcia. Garcia, however, not to take anything away from him, was a very explosive, dangerous man in the octagon. And he must come back very soon, I hope, in this lightweight division. And he could KO some more lightweights quite easily, I think. But Jared did have some circumstances that were working against him. So good on him for sticking around despite his car crash and his knee injury. And hopefully he'll make a speedy recovery to come back into the octagon before it's too late. And for the co-main event, we had, of course, Rob Font versus David Martinez, who, of course, stepped in to face Rob Font sort of on short notice, but he had a bit of time to prepare for this camp instead of Raul Rosas Jr. because Raul injured his ribs. Now, David Martinez, the young buck, won this fight via UD, and I predicted he'd get that KO victory, but Rob Font's chin is way too solid for that. He has a lot of experience, and his fight IQ alone made it really difficult to beat him. But David Martinez got that win in there. He looked great in the octagon. It was an exciting fight, not a dull moment in that fight at all. I'm really excited to see what's next for David Martinez. And of course, we'll see Rob Font coming back. There's no doubt about that either. And for the main event of the evening, of course, Diego Lopez versus Jean Silva for UFC Noche's main event, and probably one of the more conflictual fights that we've seen in the last while. Jean Silva, he said he hated Diego Lopez. So a lot of that hate came from nothing, but when he was walking into the arena, Diego Lopez said that he was getting insulted by Jean Silva's team, which is not a very professional behavior to have. I was quite disappointed to hear that even, and I hope that maybe they could clear that up a bit afterwards, because we saw at the end of the fight, of course, Diego Lopez arguing with Jean Silva's team, and also Jean Silva, once he got up, abruptly trying to hit Diego Lopez once again when the bell had rung and the fight had finished.
Incredible. His head is just leaking like a faucet right now.
Look at the damage below the left eye.
Oh, he punches him while he's walking away. He's not having it. He's not having to stop it.
So referee Mike Beltran had put a stop to this contest for the TKO victory for Diego Lopez. So there are no more punches to be thrown. I was quite disappointed to see that from Jean Silva. He may be a bit emotional, of course, seeing all his comrades lose in the last few months. That being said, that's MMA. That is the game. You don't win all the time. All four members that we know of this year that have lost their fights in the Fighting Nerds have not got clean records to begin with. So they know what losing feels like. Of course, being in the UFC and having this hype that made you so popular so quickly, and having a great name for your group, having a great gimmick with glasses and everything. I love that stuff. I bought the glasses. I'm fully into that. But of course, that does not take away from the fact that you have to be good in the octagon. And I'm not saying Jean Silva was not. I'm not saying Caio Bravo is not. But they just weren't at the level of their opponents in the last few fights that they had. And the same goes to Jean Silva, who everyone thought would win this fight via TKO or KO in the first or second round. He was favourite, of course. Diego Lopez coming into this fight as the underdog, and it's rare to see the number 2 ranked contender in a weight class coming up against the number 10 contender in the weight class, but being the underdog at number 2. Something had to give, and of course, no one could have predicted a fight as exciting as that one. I'm not going to take away from Jean Silva, who of course put up an amazing fight. Of course, Diego Lopez got the first round because he's focused on the grappling. He got Jean Silva onto the ground, almost got that TKO finish in the first, and showed us the dominance that he could have over someone that is typically more dominant over his opponent. So the first round was Diego's for sure. Second round, however, before he got his TKO finish, wasn't his round, and the significant strikes, the difference was astronomical. Jean Silva got in a lot more significant strikes, almost 3 times the amount of strikes that Diego did. However, Diego was the more intelligent striker, and after the fight, he spoke to Phil Send on the mic and said, "I deliberately got hit as many times as possible in the second round to make Jean Silva think that he was closing in on me." I'm not sure if that technique should be applied every time, because deliberately getting hit, whether it's working for Diego in this fight or the next, it may work against you as well, because Jean Silva's jabs were landing and they looked gruesome. But as I said in my last video, Diego Lopez has an amazing chin. He's never been knocked out in the UFC, and Jean Silva was not going to be the first one to do it. So maybe the technique was a great idea, perhaps not for every fighter, but for a Jean Silva who gets quite excited even when you're hitting him, then he's working with Jean's excitement and overexcitement to lure him in and get that flying elbow to then go into a TKO finish. So really beautiful flying elbow, by the way. Didn't see that coming, and neither did Jean. So it just goes to show there's levels to this stuff. And as we say all the time, when you see rising stars, like for example, Tyson Texera coming up and rising a little bit too quickly and getting top 5 or top 10 ranked opponents when they're outside the top 10 or outside the top 5, then we shouldn't be surprised that some of the holes in their game are then exposed. There are some rising stars that just make it, of course. John Jones was the best example in the whole world, the whole of UFC. But Jean Silva, being a 10th ranked featherweight contender, he was going up against someone who had gone through that whole division and he did not know what he was getting himself into. What did you guys think of Jean Silva's loss at UFC Noche? Do you believe that he has been forechecked, or do you think that that fight could have gone either way? A lot of people are saying Diego Lopez was levels above the competition. I believe Diego Lopez is levels above Jean Silva, but he didn't get forechecked. I think that Jean Silva still has what it takes to rise up in the ranks of the featherweight division and make some changes, make some improvements to be a little bit less sloppy and a little bit more vigilant sometimes. And I think at some point we'll see Jean Silva in the top 5, and at some point we may see a rematch between Lopez and Jean, seeing as there's some beef there. So I don't think he was forechecked. Do you think he was forechecked? Let me know. Did you guys watch the whole fight card? Did you just watch the main card? And what did you think overall of UFC Noche? I would love to know your opinions. Speak to you in my next video, and I hope you have a nice weekend. Bye.